My name is Thomas Reeves, and I'm a police officer in the small town of Gravesville, New Mexico. The job here had always been quiet, sometimes even boring. But one night changed everything. It was the night that made me question the reality of what I had seen. My shift started at 8 in the evening. I patrolled the town, checking familiar spots: Joe's gas station, the old Oak Bar, and the park on the outskirts of town. Gravesville was quiet and peaceful. That's why the call about a missing girl was such a shock to me. "Reeves, we have a missing person. A girl, 17 years old, last seen near the old motel on the outskirts," the dispatcher informed. I immediately headed there. When I arrived at the scene, I saw an empty parking lot and an old abandoned motel building that looked like it was straight out of a horror movie. It had been abandoned since the 90s and had long been the subject of urban legends. I recalled the stories told about the motel, ghosts, curses, and even missing people. But until that night, I hadn't believed in such things. I approached the entrance and opened the door. Inside, it was dark and cold, with the smell of dampness hitting my nose. I turned on my flashlight and started inspecting the premises. The tables were covered with a thick layer of dust, old yellowed wallpaper hung on the walls, and the floor creaked underfoot. "Police, is anyone here?" I called out, but only heard my own echo in response. Walking down the hallway, I saw an open door to one of the rooms. Carefully approaching, I peeked inside. The room was empty, but a girl's bag lay on the floor. I picked it up and opened it. Inside were documents in the name of Emily Hope. This was the missing girl. I felt something move behind me. Turning around, I saw a shadow quickly disappear around the corner. My heart began to race. I drew my gun and slowly approached the corner. "Emily, is that you?" I asked, but again there was only silence. I followed the shadow, which led me to the stairs to the second floor. Climbing them, I found myself in a hallway with numerous doors. Each one could be a trap, but I had to check. The first few rooms were empty, but when I opened the door to the fourth room, I was met with a sharp smell of rot. On the bed lay a figure covered with an old blanket. I approached and cautiously pulled back the blanket. It was Emily, but already lifeless. Her eyes were wide open, and a look of horror was frozen on her face. I felt my blood run cold. What could have scared the girl so much? Suddenly, I heard a creak behind me. Turning around, I saw the silhouette of a man standing in the doorway. "What are you doing here?" I asked, raising my gun. The man did not answer. He just stood and looked at me. His eyes were empty, like a doll's. I took a step forward, but he suddenly disappeared, as if he had dissolved into thin air. I ran to the door and looked down the corridor, but there was no one there. With trembling hands, I took out my radio and called for backup. Soon my colleagues arrived, but we never found the mysterious man. We searched every corner of the motel but found nothing suspicious. Emily's death was ruled an accident, though I was convinced there was something sinister in that motel. After that night, I began researching the history of the place and found out that in the 70s, people often went missing there. The locals believed the motel was cursed and avoided it. I returned to the motel several more times, trying to find any evidence or answers, but each time I was met only by silence and cold. Over time, I started seeing shadows and hearing voices even in my own home. I realized that the motel had left its mark on my soul. Now I live with these memories, with this horror that haunts me every night. And though many don't believe in ghosts and curses, I know they exist, because I saw it with my own eyes. Sometimes the scariest things hide not in the dark, but in our own minds. I am a police officer in a small town on the coast of Maine. My name is Michael. I've been working in the police force for 15 years, and in that time, I've seen a lot of strange and terrifying things. But there's one story I can't forget. It still haunts my dreams, and I'll share it with you. It happened in the fall, when fog is a frequent guest on our streets. One night, around midnight, we received a call from a local woman named Mary. She said her son, Joshua, had gone missing. The boy was only 10 years old. He had been playing near their house and hadn't come back. I immediately drove to the scene. Mary's house was on the edge of town, near an old forest that locals called the Cursed Woods. The name came from ancient legends saying the forest was cursed, and anyone who entered it risked never returning. When I arrived, I saw Mary standing on the porch, trembling with fear. She said Joshua had gone to play near the forest and disappeared. I grabbed my flashlight and headed toward the forest, feeling the fog envelop me from all sides. The forest was eerily silent, and each step I took sounded like thunder in the oppressive silence. I began calling out for Joshua, but there was no answer. After walking a bit further, I noticed something strange, toys lying on the ground that belonged to Joshua. It was odd because he never scattered his things. I picked up one of the toys, a small wooden soldier. It was his favorite toy. As I walked further, I began to feel a strange sensation, as if someone was watching me. I looked around but saw nothing except the thick fog. And then I heard a whisper. It was quiet, barely audible, but I clearly heard my name. Michael. I stopped and listened. The whisper repeated, and this time it was louder. Michael, help me. It was Joshua's voice. I hurried in the direction from which I heard the voice, but the fog became even thicker, and I began to lose my bearings. Suddenly I saw a silhouette. It was Joshua. He was standing with his back to me, looking into the depths of the forest. I called out to him, but he didn't respond. When I got closer, he suddenly turned around. His eyes were empty, and his face was pale. He began whispering something incomprehensible, and then disappeared as if he had dissolved into the fog. I was in shock and didn't know what to do. It felt like the forest was playing some sick game with me. I continued to search for Joshua, but every time I got close to his voice, it would vanish. Finally, I came upon an old cabin. It looked abandoned and dilapidated, but the door was open. I went inside and saw that it was completely dark. My heart was pounding, and I felt cold sweat running down my back. In the darkness, I heard the same whisper again. Michael, help me. I raised my flashlight and saw that Joshua was sitting in the corner, but his eyes were empty and dead. Suddenly, the cabin door slammed shut with a loud bang, and I felt a wave of terror wash over me. I rushed to the door, but it was locked. That's when I realized I was trapped. The whisper grew louder and more terrifying. I began to lose consciousness, and the last thing I remember was a horrifying laugh echoing in my head. I woke up in the hospital. Mary was sitting next to me, holding my hand. She said I had found Joshua but couldn't save him. The doctor said I had spent the whole night in the forest and was in a state of deep shock when they found me. I returned to work, but this story left a permanent mark on my life. I no longer go near the cursed woods and try not to think about that incident. But every night, when the fog envelops the town, I hear the same whisper. Michael, help me. And I know the forest will never let me go. I've been a police officer for 15 years. Today, I will share a story that I will never forget, even though I wish I could. It happened a few years ago in a small town in the southern United States where I served. It was a regular evening patrol when my partner and I received a call about strange noises and lights in an abandoned hospital building. The hospital had been closed for about 10 years, and there were rumors about eerie things happening there. People talked about ghosts, strange sounds, and even disappearances. We headed to the scene. As we approached the hospital, we noticed that the building was indeed lit from within, even though the windows were boarded up. It looked unnatural, as the electricity had been cut off long ago. We stopped and decided to check out what was happening inside. The front doors were ajar. Entering inside, we were immediately hit by the smell of mold and old age. The stairs leading to the upper floors were covered in dust and cobwebs. We raised our flashlights and moved forward. The corridors were eerily quiet, only the sound of our footsteps echoing off the walls. The first floor was empty. We walked to the stairs and climbed to the second floor. There we heard a faint crying. It was a sound that made our blood run cold. We moved toward the sound and found ourselves in front of one of the rooms. The door was locked. We decided to break it down, and when the door opened, we saw a little girl sitting in the corner. She was crying, hugging her knees. We approached her and asked what happened. The girl raised her large tear-filled eyes to us and whispered, "He will come for you." We tried to find out who he was, but the girl suddenly disappeared right before our eyes. We were stunned. Was it some kind of trick with the light? Could it be our imagination? Suddenly, a loud noise echoed in the corridor behind us, as if someone was walking heavily on the floor. We rushed there, but the corridor was empty. Then the crying was heard again, this time from another room. We followed the sound and found that the door was locked from the inside. It opened by itself as we approached. Inside it was dark, but we saw the same large eyes of the girl looking at us from the darkness. She repeated, "He will come for you." We stepped back, trying to understand what was happening. The situation was becoming more and more unpredictable. I suggested calling for backup, but the radio wasn't working. The connection to the outside world was cut off. Suddenly, all the lights went out, and we were plunged into absolute darkness. Only our flashlights provided a little illumination in front of us. We decided to go down to the first floor and find a way out, but the stairs were gone. In their place was a solid wall. We then realized we were trapped. There was no way out. We returned to the corridor and started searching for another path. It seemed that the corridors were changing, leading us in different directions, but there was no exit. The girl's crying continued to haunt us. We tried to find her, but every time we got close to the sound, it moved to another place. It was like a horrible maze with no way out. Finally, we reached a large room that looked like an operating room. There we saw an old surgical table, and on it lay our colleague. His eyes were open, but he wasn't moving. It looked as if he was alive, but in a state of deep shock. We tried to approach him, but suddenly his body began to tremble, and he started to scream with an inhuman voice. The scream was so piercing that we covered our ears. Then everything suddenly stopped, and he lay still. His face was twisted in horror. We tried to bring him back to consciousness, but all our efforts were in vain. Then we heard footsteps. They were getting closer and closer. We turned around and saw a tall man in a long black coat. His face was hidden by a hood, but his eyes glowed with some inhuman light. He slowly approached us. We tried to stop him, but our bullets went through him as if he wasn't there. He raised his hand, and we felt a chill envelop us. It was like death itself had touched us. My partner fell to the floor, his body convulsed, and then he froze. I knew I was next. Darkness began to engulf me, and the last thing I remember was his eyes piercing into my soul. I woke up in a hospital. They told me I was found unconscious near the abandoned building. My partner was never found. His body had disappeared as if he had never existed. The story haunts me to this day. I no longer believe in ghosts, but what happened that night made me doubt reality. I don't know what it was, but I know one thing. Some mysteries are better left unsolved.